Hi everyone. Very happy to introduce William Shaw. Start us off with an intro to you and your books, William.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm William Shaw. I've been a member of UK Crime Book Club for what feels like a very long time, and very good as it is. I write crime fiction, and I write, which is obviously why I'm here. I've written a lot of detective fiction, and a couple of series in that. My last is a series starring a Sergeant Alexandra Cupidi, but I wanted to take a little break from that, so I wrote a couple of thrillers. And the latest of those is a thriller called The Conspirators. Um, the reason I wanted to do this, I really liked reading big adventure thrillers when I was a kid, the sort that travel around the world where people do heroic things together. And I was just wondering whether they kind of had a life in our, at the moment. And so I was having a go at I wrote one called Dead Rich, which was set on a yacht in the Caribbean. And The Conspirators is really about, I was trying to work out how blokes can be heroes without having to hit things. And so there's a guy in this book called Jacob, and he's a translator. He's a language teacher and a translator, and he's really skint. And his girlfriend desperately wants him to raise some money so they can buy a flat together, and he's really trying to keep his girlfriend, who's very glamorous and much in a class above poor Jacob. And so somebody offers him this job, doing a bit of interpreting. Now, he's not an interpreter, but he says, "Oh yeah, I'll do it," without thinking, and gets whisked away in a luxury jet to Austria and this fantastic house where he has to translate between Hindi, English, and Russian. And the penny finally drops that actually he's been kind of people trafficked. We always think of people trafficking as being sort of like low class sort of people building roads or whatever, stuff like that. But actually, he's been people trafficked to translate, because these two rival gangs can't communicate properly with each other and they need a translator. And he suddenly realized he's got himself in a real mess in these two ultra violent kind of gangs who are dealing in something which I won't tell you because it's a bit of a spoiler. Well, maybe I will as the evening goes on. And he's only got one power. He can't hit things. He's a bit of a weed like myself, but he does understand languages. And as the book goes on, he realizes that's actually the best power he's got. He's the only person there who understands everything that's going on. And so his real challenge is to work out how he can use that to beat these people.
No spoilers. They're allowed. You've got a lot of hellos. Donna's called you one of the nicest men in crime fiction.
Oh, thanks, Donna. That's a very lovely thing to hear.
Very true. Sam says you're not allowed a QPD break.
Oh, okay. Hello from South Carolina. Now, who's in South Carolina? Because I can only see
Judy Shirley.
Hello. Okay, brilliant to see you. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here. It's been a while.
And Tony Millington, he said hello, evening, everyone.
Oh, fantastic.
And thanks. Steve is watching as well, apparently.
So please feel free to chip in at any time and ask me stuff once Caroline's questions have dried up, or even before.
I liked you put in the sort of acknowledgements at the back that you wanted to have someone whose superpower was language with Jacob. And I really like that kind of idea, because I don't think that feels unique, that you've sort of got a hero whose superpower is.
Yeah, I think there's all sorts of heroes. And when I was growing up, really heroes only did a couple of things: was stand around looking handsome or hit people. And I think there's a lot more to it. Oh, hi, Steve. Oh, fantastic. It's so it's a challenge for me to do that, because I think it's easier in contemporary stuff to quite often do a bit. I've started writing women, and you can make women do more heroic stuff because it's not been done by blokes so much. You've got to be a bit careful, I think, because there's nothing like blokes writing women as kind of super women just to show how right on they are. But I think there's a real challenge about how we write men, and I don't mean that in a really earnest sort of serious way. It's and I think there's a lot of interesting men sort of protagonists around. But I'm the least physical person in the world. The idea of hitting somebody actually scares me. The actual hitting of it. I've been in one proper fight in my life, and that was just me being knocked over on a pavement. And I couldn't do that sort of stuff. And I just sort of think, well, there's got to be other ways to do it. And actually, just hitting people can't be the only answer. It's quite useful, obviously, if you can hit people. But, there's got to be other types of men. And I quite like figuring out ways in which they can do, be the centre of it. Because, I think for a while, most of the men I write are quite mild mannered in that sort of sense, and so, and yet, the whole point of a thriller or a crime fiction book is somebody has to take control of the narrative at some point. So it's just ways in which they do that. In Dead Rich, it was a similar kind of bloke. Dead Rich, the protagonist, was like a pop star who was used to being handsome and good looking and having women flock around him, but his power's waning. He's not as good looking as he used to be as he goes into his 30s, and his fans are disappearing. So again, he's just got to be smart, and actually ally himself to somebody or other. There's a woman in Dead Rich who actually is quite physical and does the clever stuff. So I think we rewrite the genres. I think the really nice thing about all our type of genre fiction is it evolves. If you look at a lot of the people who are writing locked room stuff now, and there's a lot of great sort of locked room stuff that has a nod back to the past. It's not in a pure, white, clean, squeaky 1930s world anymore. The world is complicated and it's full of complicated people, and it's not just in the vicarage, even if you might be visiting a vicarage. Kind of, it's like, how do you do that thing but actually accept that the world's a very different place and there's a different we've got a different outlook on the world these days, haven't we? So we quite like the old forms, but we can't just let them be. That's a lot of witchery, isn't it?
No, but it's good. How much of it comes from sort of some of your experiences, though? Because obviously you were a music journalist, you have globe-trotted a little bit.
I've been around about a bit. I think everything. I'm always amazed when you get young writers coming out. There's a lot of young writers who come out and they can say fully formed stuff. I didn't really have. I didn't know how I could tell stories that had anything to them until I was quite old. And I think, having been a journalist, and I was a journalist, and I did all sorts of journalism, sort of some undercover journalism. I did lots of music journalism, and I did. I lived in different places. And I think you raid it all the time. I'm just thinking of writing a story set in California in 1900. It's just one of the things I'm toying with at the moment. And that was really weird because when I was in my, I suppose I must have been in my 40s. I did a month's living in the Utah desert as a Stone Age man, and this was a bit of journalism. And so they literally dumped us in the middle of the desert in Utah. They gave us some small bits of food and things like that, but basically, I think we had like a banana for the first 2 days, and there were people like starving. And I was one of the older ones, but lots of them were these young American people, and they were just like so miserable because they weren't near any fast food outlets, and they'd lie in the desert at night watching as planes went over, saying, "I wonder what they're eating up there." Stuff like that. But it was a really interesting experience because there was a kind of lot of survivalism going on. It was part of a Mormon community, it turned out to be. But there was a great story I read there about. In fact, I've got it here because I'm reading it for the thing. This thing called Ishi, and he was supposedly the last Neolithic American, and discovered in 1911 in California. And I was reading this while I was in the desert, and I can remember thinking then, I want to write a book about that. I want to write kind of like a detective story around that character. So I think you just accumulate interesting baggage the longer you've been doing stuff, and you keep thinking, you just have it up there thinking, how can that make a story? Yeah.
So you were saying you wanted to write adventure books, which you've done really well with Dead Rich and the Conspirators, by the way.
Thank you.
Love both of them.
Brilliant.
Huge fan. What kind of books inspired you to write those?
Well, all sorts, really. I was thinking about that because, in terms of those adventure books, I've read Neville Shute a lot, and I don't know if anybody's ever read A Town Called Alice, which is quite old-fashioned now. It's such a cracking story, and I reread it.
Isn't it?
To read the rest, and those big sprawling adventures that literally it takes you around the world, doesn't it? And yet there's this really painful romance of it. He always did that brilliantly. So it's stuff like that. And some of the writing feels a bit old-fashioned now, but it's really good. He's such a great storyteller. He starts from the oddest place and draws you in. What else? So it's anything from things like I like Raymond Carver short stories, and in fact, if you ever read those, I think they're kind of like a really good lesson in how to write, because he gives you the smallest number of facts in any story, and from that you've got to build the story in your head. You just know a location, you get some little hints dropped in the speech and stuff like that. And I think that's a really inspiring sort of way to learn. There was a book called Waterland by Colin Swift. It was a big sort of Bookery Prize, and that mixed landscape, and it's a murder story, Waterland. If it had been published today, it would have been published as crime fiction. That was a 1980s novel, and that's got sort of like weird natural history and detection. So all sorts of things sort of pulled me in those various directions. I mean, I love George Simenon. I like the Maigret stories. I just used to inhale those as a kid. They're really short and readable. Yeah, lots of stuff.
Is Town Called Alice your favourite Neville Shute? Or
I missed that, Gaz.
Is The Town Called Alice your favourite Neville Shute book?
Oh, I think it is, yeah, actually, because I read a few more just recently, and I just think it's really kind of perfect, because it's horrible as well. I mean, at the centre of Town Called Alice, there's this real sort of torture and sort of, it's a prison camp story. Yeah, but it's really good. But yeah, I mean, I read some of the other ones, and I think they're all stunningly good, actually. Sort of need digging out again. But it's a curious that time, because all those big writers from that time, like Len Deighton, Desmond Bagley, and people like that, they're so out of fashion right now, which for me means that there's something there that needs bringing back. But yeah. Oh, thanks very much, Michael. He's just said, just finished my new book and loved it. Bless you, Michael.
Yeah, he is a big fan of both of them, I think, isn't he? Sarah said it was great to meet you at Harrogate, and Sam wants to know if you ever get used to how much of energy events take.
Sam wants to know what's right.
Do you ever get used to how much energy events take?
I get energy from them. I think if you're a writer, you are basically stuck on your own most of your time, and it's really brilliant to talk to other people, because it stops you. Really, it's quite helpful actually, getting out and talking to people. I think all writers need a bit of that. I mean, some writers are quite shy and don't do it, but yeah, I think events are really. It's sort of. I'm surprised. I'm just amazed anybody wants to listen to an author wittering on, because I can understand reading books, but what's happened is really interesting that people enjoy talking to writers and listening to them talk. But it's really useful, and you get kind of feedback from people. You can kind of tell when books have worked as well from how people react, and I think that's really useful. I think it's been a fantastic addition, and it's this really weird thing, and I talk about it quite a lot sometimes, that when I was a kid, books were just something you mostly read on your own. You might discuss them in school, or you might meet somebody who's read it and say, yeah, that was good, wasn't it? Yeah, it was good. And that's the extent of the conversation. But now they've sort of, since the internet gave away a sort of platform to discuss them through things like this, but even through email, so you can form book groups and stuff like that, they've changed completely, and they've become things you discuss. So the discussion of the book is almost part of the fun, isn't it? And I think, the fact that you meet other people, and, UK Crime Book Club is an amazing example of that, because you meet other people with similar tastes so you can discuss books. And not only does that bring people together, it brings them together in a really interesting way. Because if somebody says, oh, I really like M.W. Craven books, so do I. You've got not just one thing in common, you've got actually the body of work in common. You've got all sorts of things you can discuss. And even if you find that person, if you're a complete anti-Brexiter and they're a pro-Brexiter, it doesn't matter, because you both like books by Andy Hill, or whatever these by Ellie Griffiths. It brings people together in really extraordinary ways, and I really love that. I just think it's been one of the more positive things that's gone on in my life, because not all of them have been positive in progress, but I think the way the books have become these social things is bloody brilliant.
I think as someone who likes to read as well, it is nice to go and listen to authors witter on.
But don't you find it's also nice? I mean, it's the community as well, isn't it? It is really nice being able to say to people, you've just got so many things in common with books these days, because you've got platforms in which you can discuss them, whether it's Goodreads or this or stuff. There's different places you can do it. And, I always remember this book group I went to go and see in Sussex, and they lived in an estate miles from anywhere. And it had been a kind of like, the cottages were the old sort of workers who lived there in the families. So they're quite a lot poorer than the people who moved into the luxury cottages that been built to make the estate money, and they didn't talk to each other, these two sets of people. And then this American arrived, and she put a flyer through everybody's door saying, "Let's form a book group." And from that moment on, the whole community was talking to each other. And every year they have two parties on this estate at Christmas and in the summer. They have a big summer barbecue. But it's all because of the book group. That's what brought people together. And I just think book groups have this extraordinary power.
Do you find the energy different when it's the events that you organise? Because you've got Shoreham on Sea coming up, haven't you? It's sold out. Well done.
Thank you very much. Actually, they put a sliver of more tickets on sale if anybody goes onto the shorehamwordfest.com website. They took some off from the individual events. They've stolen some from Richard Osman and put them on channel sale. The amount of organising stuff, as you well know, when you organise the stuff, there's a different level of stress, isn't there? You're responsible. I started organising book events. Really, I'd done a thing in Brighton, non-fiction thing called the Brighton Moment years ago before I was successfully writing fiction, and I got so stressed out by that. But we had an event where I got lots of Brighton writers to write true short stories about Brighton. We did that for a couple of years in the Brighton Festival, and that was my sort of cutting my teeth on organising events. And then when my first book came out, I asked Ellie Griffiths and Leslie Thompson, two local writers who I did not know at the time, and also Susan Wilkins, who now lives in Devon, to do some events with me because I needed to get my book out there. And being other writers, they all said yes, and I discovered the real pleasure. They became best friends, but also just, so I organised this tour. But that was quite stressful because the first one we did in Lewis, and we had like 20 people in the room. Hooray. Second one we did in somewhere like Haywards Heath, and there was one person. And I was thinking, this is all my fault. I dragged these people, across the country to this event. There's nobody there. And Ellie Griffiths took me to one side and says, it doesn't matter. You can never predict whether that one person is going to be the person who tells 20 people or, whatever. As it was, that one person sat us down and said, well, actually, I brought my own self-published book, and she didn't want to listen to us at all. But that's another story.
Oh, dear. Steve has actually said that it's interesting to hear you, Ellie and Leslie, talk about writing. It's like a social visit for the three of you.
I missed all that. What was that again?
Steve said it's interesting the way you, Ellie, and Leslie talk about writing is great.
Oh, that's
like a social visit with the three of you.
Well, I have to say I've learned a great deal from them, actually. Both, especially in if anybody's ever seen Ellie Griffiths talk, and you've probably seen her talk here, she is the most generous person. She really sounds like when she's talking, she's waiting to be enlightened by you lot, not the other way around. Do you know what I mean? She's got this real openness about the way she talks, and she's just really excited to talk and stuff. And I think it's really, I've learned a lot from her about how to behave actually as a writer, because I think a lot of writers are quite nervous and they think they've got to spend the whole time plugging their book, and obviously that is part of it. We are plugging books, but I think you learn quite quickly from being around people like her that actually if you like and trust the writer, you'll be interested in investigating their books. And actually, in this crowded space, if everybody's trying to sell their book too hard, it's a bit wearying for everybody, isn't it? You don't you want to hear a bit about the book, but I don't know, what do you want to hear about?
We want to hear about your book.
but you know what I mean? It's it's quite big, and you hear, and I'm sure I was exactly the same when I started. You think you've got to really work hard. I did a whole radio interview on the day of publication, and I walked out the studio, and the last thing the presenter said, "Oh, and by the way, the book's called The Conspirators," and I realised I'd completely forgot to mention the title all the way through, which is the one thing the PR tells you have to do all the way through. But I'm just, in terms of books, it's difficult because you don't want to say, oh, this is a brilliant book. You don't know whether it's a brilliant book. I never know really how well. It's always a surprise to me if people like it. When Michael says those sort of things like that. And I don't mean that in a sort of humble brag kind of way. I think the experience of writing a book and the experience of reading it are so completely different. And I'm just always relieved.
You've got a lot of love for quite a lot of your books. Do you still feel like that even after
I'm amazed. I don't mean that I don't mean that in a humble brag sort of way, but I also read lots of other books and I think, wow, they're amazing as well. And I think I think I tend to think other people's books are, I think it's a useful thing for any writer as well, just to be in awe of everybody else's writing and not in awe of your own, because you don't want to think it's that special, do you? You've got to keep trying hard at it. You've got to keep trying to make it as good as the other books you read. That sounds really like I'm over egging it. I mean, I love it, and occasionally I do. I get very proud of a sentence I've written or something like that. But generally, I think you just see all the cracks and like Conspirators was one of the least fun writing experiences I've ever had.
Really?
Yeah, I hated writing the book, and I don't mean that in any. It was a real. For some reason, it was a real slog. The first draft was completely wrong. The second draft was also completely wrong. And by the end of the first draft, I generally know what I'm doing, and I really didn't. And I was starting to sweat and panic because you're a genre writer. You're supposed to hand in a book every year, and your income depends on it, and also your reputation does. And I was convinced this was a complete catastrophe. And my editor worked really much harder than he has to work on it, things like that. And then suddenly it all clicked, and it did. But I hated writing it for much of it, which is an unusual experience for me because I think the writers all hate some bit of writing their book. But I didn't like a lot of that. And yet, my editor tells me it came out really nicely. And I think that's the sort of, you get this is what I'm trying to say, is a weird disconnect between the writing and the experience of reading. And whereas I've just written another Cupidity book and it was just like a joy and it came out just like, fell out. But because sometimes I think, and I had a chat with lots of writers of this, there's no relation to the amount of pain and sweat you have in writing it and whether it's a good book or not.
How do you feel about it now it's finished and out? Do you
Well,
know
I'm proud of all my
it's a good book, or are you like?
I'm like a parent who doesn't dare say which of their books is children is their favourite. I really, when I first had the proof, it took me a long time to get around to reading it because I thought, oh, this isn't going to be very good because I didn't enjoy it. And then I read it and I was pleasantly surprised. And I like it. I really, I think that whole thing, and also it's got an ending I really like, and so has Dead Rich. And very occasionally, I think a book called The Birdwatcher, I think, has an ending I'm really proud of. But both The Conspirators and Dead Rich have endings I just thought, oh, that's nice, that works. And I'm a big fan of endings. Do you know what I mean? I think something else has to happen at the ending that you didn't really know when you're setting about writing it, and I like that sort of thing.
It does have quite a nice ending. Because we won't spoil it, but it does have you're right, it is a good ending.
I do like a good ending. I mean, a good beginning and a good ending. Also, a good middle is obviously quite useful.
Good all the way through. Donna said she likes learning about authors, and has bought books as much because she likes the author than she likes the sound of the book.
I totally agree. Yeah, same with me actually. I kind of think if I trust them and their world, and I think in some ways it shouldn't be. It's all to do with it, but I think, of course, it is, isn't it? Who the writer is. That's part of it. Part of the book. I mean, there were all these very pompous sort of things, weren't there, by sort of literature departments in the 1980s and 90s, saying, "Oh, it's just a text. The author's irrelevant." You kind of think, no, it's not.
No, and I think that's one of the nice things about things opening up, isn't it? Because you can have that relationship where you know something about the author of the book as well.
Yeah, definitely.
You connect it and you have a different feeling about the books because you know who the author is.
Donna says, I haven't found organising outside of Brighton stressful at all. I'm not sure whether that's sarcastic or genuine, but I hope it's genuine, which is the dark side of Brighton, which happens in later in October.
Yeah, to be honest, I thought it was quite good fun organising.
Is it?
The event, yeah. Maybe because it's like something out of the usual.
I woke up last night. I tell you what, I woke up because of we sold so many tickets because we were originally talking about having 200 people in the room for Shoreham for the Fatal Shore, and we've ended out getting about 250 people in the room. And last year it was quite hard to get a sandwich. And so I woke up at like 3 o'clock in the morning saying, how are all these people going to get sandwiches? And sent off an email this morning to Rosalind, who's the sort of practical one who's doing all the organising. How's this going to work? We've got to get a cafe involved and things like that. She said, sorted, Willie. Calm down. It's sorted. But, so things like that stress me out a lot. The idea of having angry, hungry people in a room for the afternoon session would be terrifying.
I like that you get stressed about things like sandwiches. It's adorable. Steve wants to know when the Conspirators is going to be out in America.
God, that's such a pain, Steve. So what's really happened is that back in the previous decade, I was published by a company in the States, quite a good, Mulholland, a great publishing house, and they published like 4 of my books, and then they dropped me because I wasn't selling enough. Foolishly, they dropped me, which happens to a lot of people. It happened to Mark Billingham. He was with the same lot. But what happens after then is, because it takes quite a long time to get another deal, because you've not succeeded in America. And so I'm just having to work through that, just to have to prove, because it's really infuriating. I mean, like, a lot of my readers are Canadian, and because Canada is effectively a territory of America when it comes to books, they can't get them either. And my agent's really holding out on this, because she could allow the digital rights over there, but of course that makes it less sellable for the whole deal. So I dearly love and respect my agent, so she's just holding out. It's quite a bizarre situation, but hopefully it will be resolved sooner or later, because it's just, it's idiotic in this world where, you're over there in California, Steve, watching this, and you can't buy the books directly. You're aware of them, like the world that, Amazon goes everywhere, but sometimes you just can't buy, and it drives you nuts. And the other thing that drove me nuts about that is that Mulholland insisted on renaming them all. They had these old spurious reasons of the market, so that I have books with completely different titles in America. And then people buy them twice because they think it's different books, and then they get angry, and they get angry at me, whereas actually it was just the publishers being a bit mad.
Yeah, I was going to say the same, Donna. I'm sure we can organise one for Steve. He says he's ordered it from the UK.
Oh, yeah. But it's, if you could do that to everybody in America, that'd be fantastic. Thank you very much.
And he also said, drop you, are they insane? Do you get a better response to kind of the G.W. Shaw books overseas, or just because they're a bit more...
Weirdly enough, it's the Cupidity stuff that people are more interested in abroad, and it's the other way around, because I was partly doing those international ones to see if I could interest America in a bit, but they're not. I mean, funnily enough, the thing that will sell is actually, rural England. People are interested in. I mean, that's actually travels better, because a lot of detective fiction has become harder to sell in the States at the moment. But I think that sort of place-specific stuff, other countries quite like, because you're looking at a sort of bit of geography. So, but on the other hand, you should just still write the books you want to write rather than go chasing these things. I think it's you drive yourself mad trying to find books that will work in America, but not. It's really interesting that a lot of there's a lot of British thrillers. Like the hardcore thrillers, like Lee Child and things like that do really well in the States, despite the fact they're written by British people about that America. I don't know, but and Steve Kavanagh's doing that, and M.W. Craven is as well. But I don't know. The book marketing and the book publishing world, as everybody observes, is a strange place, and it's a really it's. I don't think anybody who claims to fully understand book publishing is lying.
Fair enough. I was wondering earlier, like, how you choose the locations you go to,
right,
in the books.
Are
they places you've been in that you know about, or are they like...
I didn't know anything about Austria, I have to say.
Looking for a good, like, evil villain type house.
I wanted an evil villain type lair, and actually there was this. I tell you what, I chose Austria for a reason, that it is actually there is a person who's very like my protagonist, who is stuck in Austria because he has been booted out of other countries, and America's trying to extradite him, which is similar to my hero. And so I thought, I know this has happened to this one person, so I'll make it Austria. But literally could have been anywhere, that book, in sort of ways. Once you've close it there, then you find a bit about the place. The Caribbean for Dead Rich was just, I was right, I was in lockdown. Didn't we all want to be on a super yacht in the Caribbean for part of that? I actually started it before lockdown, but it really got energized around then because I just thought, God, wouldn't that be nice? And it's foolish, really, because I think if I'd written it now, I'd have gone there to do some research. But as it is, I've never been. Well, I've been to Jamaica once, but you know, as a journalist,
did you do any traveling for research for the Conspirators, or
not a bit. No, that was all traveling in my imagination. Because again, that started at the tail of the second lockdown. So again, it was like wanting to be in other places, and some of it set in Brighton, which I know quite well.
I mean, that helps, doesn't it?
I think it does, and you know, it's interesting because like Peter May, who I'm very pleased to have got to know over this time. You know, he was going to set a book in Svalbard, and he'd got all ready for it, and the deal's all done, things like that. And then lockdown happened, and he couldn't travel to Svalbard, and so he jumped the book. Because whereas I would think I would have probably made it up. But he is just like, and if I haven't been there and I can't see it honestly, I won't write about it. And I've got a lot of respect for that. But I also like, you know, there's some books were set in completely imaginary places. What was that book set in the Arctic, written by somebody or other who'd never been there? You know, I think you can all, you know, we've got an imagination. Maybe we feel good using it.
No, I think if I was going to write a book set in the Arctic, I'd want to go.
Yeah, well, I wish I'd gone to the Caribbean. I had to lean on Nadine Matheson a bit occasionally because she's from Grenada, which wasn't the island I was writing about, but you know, it's not too far away.
Yeah, so she could help a bit.
Yeah.
You always mention who you've got help from, because you had help from some people who are like Ukrainian refugees and things for you. And
it's a weird connection, really. There's a guy called Marek who I also credit because he's a guy who wrote a book which inspired the start of this. My friend called Marek, and I actually got the title of his book wrong in the acknowledgements, which is very bad. But he wrote. He's Polish and lives in Brighton. He sort of second generation Polish. He got really interested in. He began learning as Brexit happened. He wanted to feel more Polish, so he started relearning Polish, which he spoke as a child. He got very interested in bilingualism. And he wrote a really good book about it called Four Words for Friends. And it's just about what it does to the brain and to your social attitudes if you are bilingual. Because obviously most of us in England, we struggle with one language, let alone two. And so I took, that was the starting point really for the Conspirators, his book. But he came to me a bit later because I play in a Ceilidh band. I'm a really bad musician. We do lots of dancing. He said there's this woman called Vladislava. She's recently arrived refugee, and she's a Ukrainian folk dancer. Can you meet her? Because she's feeling a bit lost over here and wants some, you know, is really missing dance stuff. So we did this Ceilidh with her calling some Ukrainian dances. And it was a nightmare because Ukrainian dancing is really complicated. But, you know, we sort of became friends over this. So when I was talking about, there's a character in this who's Ukrainian, and it was kind of slightly based on some of the stuff she told me and the sort of worldview of the sort of refugee community. Because I mean, like everywhere, there's a lot of Ukrainians. We've got a lot of Ukrainian refugees in Brighton, yeah, I mean, it's part of the modern world at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's kind of good in a way, a bit like, although I suppose it's a bit like with the lockdown thing, it's how much do you want to write about kind of things that are happening in the world at the moment.
Yeah, that's
important that we reflect some of them in fiction, but I can understand why people would choose not to.
Completely, and it's how you do it because it's entertainment, isn't it? The whole thing is a crime book must be fun above all. You know, I keep talking about Ellie Griffiths, but I love the way she wrote about lockdown in the locked room, because it was just like, what a weird memory. You suddenly brought it back to you. Well, it wasn't like central to the book, but in some ways it's a really good document of what it was like during lockdown, because she keeps really good diaries, and I think she uses them a lot in her kind of, you know, as part of thinking through stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think the great thing about crime for me, and we all like it for different reasons, the great thing about crime for me is that it's a genre that exists in the real world. And part of the thing we have to do when we're writing a book is convince you that bad things are going to happen. Because the main thing we want is that you're a murder or two. We want a book with a murder or two in it. But murders are quite hard to convince readers are real. And so what you do is you mess around with the real world. You start writing the real world and you put in some real facts, real places, in order to sort of create that scene in which you can be horrible to people. And I think that's made it. I honestly think that's one of the most fascinating things about the whole genre is that mixture that there's always bits of reality in all crime fiction, even if it's psychological reality or stuff like that. It's the bits you recognise, think, oh yeah, and once you've got the reader thinking, oh yeah, I know that, you can mess with their heads.
That it does work. Donna said it was creepy. It was so real. Ellie stuff. I guess it's like I went to an exhibition about COVID and the vaccine at the Science Museum in London, and it's weird how much you had forgotten, even though it's such recent history.
Yeah. No, I couldn't. It's a very weird experience for all of us, isn't it? The kind of it feels like a dream that we're all in. It really is so strange. You know, the idea that suddenly, like now, over 2 years and more ago, just seems bizarre. Well, how long is it? It's a long time ago now, but it just feels. Some of it feels like it happened yesterday. It's the weirdest thing. When I was growing up, I used to think, God, I've been through the power cuts. I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember the 1970s power cuts. They were really formative because you were basically stuck for hours in a dark house or a dark school with all these people. And so you had a different experience. And I just think nothing my children will go through will ever compare to the power cuts. Little did I know, I mean, they were just like a little pimple compared to what happened in COVID, weren't they? So the whole idea of people being in the same room and house together for so long. But yeah.
Well, because I'm a bit of a weirdo, and like since I spent years wondering what would happen if we had a pandemic.
Did you?
Like,
because you're a biologist, obviously.
Yeah, I think so, maybe. And I was just like, this isn't how what I thought. But
no, and there's that woman I know. Oh God, I've forgotten her name now. But she wrote a whole series based on it, and so actually Peter May had written a book about it. Actually imagining pandemic worlds, because of course policing during a pandemic is suddenly something else. Who knew that burglary was going to just completely disappear for a year? Crimes were a different type, weren't they? Everything just changed. Investigating people was suddenly really complicated because you couldn't just go around knocking on doors.
Didn't Peter May say he had problems getting lockdown published initially because people didn't believe it would happen?
People thought it was too extreme, which was interesting. But he's a really interesting story because he was a writer who'd written loads and loads of books and had very little success until the Lewis trilogy, and very little success in this country. I mean, he was sustained by France, which was about the only country that published him well. And he'd been writing these great books forever, so that when he was finally successful, he had this huge backlist of really great books, which have been being issued ever since. But now he's run out of them. He's got to keep doing, But
yeah, I'm a big fan of his China series.
Yeah. And they were extraordinary. You see, he really, really researched this. I mean, he went to China to completely do all that stuff. Yeah. I realise I'm not. I'm wearing a headset, and I've realised I'm not actually plugged in. That's quite clever.
Oh, have you plugged yourself in now?
Did you just hear my email arrival there?
Yeah.
Let me see if I. Yeah. Let me try that.
We don't mind hearing your email arrival.
That's better. Does that sound any different? No. So much for buying expensive headsets, eh?
Thank you as well, by the way, for the acknowledgement for me and Sam and the UK Crime Book Club in your book.
I'm really, I mean, well, it's been great to watch this whole community grow, hasn't it? I mean, it's just, I think in publishing is not publishing is this really pyramidical sort of structure, which few people at the top get lots of attention, and it's really nice to have something like UK Crime Book Club, which is pretty democratic to all writers who just, as long as they get what the club is and who it's for. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just like so many people from different bits of their publishing journey sort of have a voice here. I think that's very generous of you, and it's been brilliant to see it grow at such a ludicrous speed. But also, I mean, as everybody's aware, it's not like it's a policed community, if I say David, but it's a community which exists because there are certain standards, and I think it's quite hard to do that. I think, I don't know how did it come? Had you all been on horrible book groups first for you to actually set up on something quite civilized? How did you decide to actually that you're going? Did you decide on how you're going to have a UK crime book club as a particular type of book club? No.
No, we got ejected from a book club because of my dad. And then he decided he would set up our own.
What did he do wrong, if that's not indiscreet?
Probably just being a grumpy Yorkshireman, I think.
Wow. Yeah.
Discrimination
against grumpy Yorkshiremen.
I mean, it happens, doesn't it? Not everyone likes it.
Does, no, that's the thing. But it happens less. And there's always somebody who's going to be put out by sort of things like that. But it does seem to have a very, a good way of just keeping everybody just reminding what their duties to the group are, which I think is quite good. And I was very glad you got onto the, labeling photographs, all that basic stuff that's really hard to remember to do for even people like me who use it quite a lot. You just got to remind yourself. But you set that as a basic standard. I think that just helps everybody's consciousness that this is a community and everybody's coming from a different place on it.
Well, you are a lot of the reason that some of our things in our community happen. So we appreciate you right back.
I did. You see, this is the thing we were just talking about before we went live. There's a thing called Be Live. When lockdown happened, I went completely nuts in the first few days and thought, how can I find my tribe again? So I began doing these things using Be Live. And so Kaz and Sam and sort of then came to me and said, how do you do that? And it works, doesn't it? It's a good way of...
It works brilliantly. Yeah. We've never looked back since you taught us how to do it.
And it was great fun. That I did them I think I did them 4 days a week at 4:00. By which time I'd used up every contact I had in crime fiction. But I had great things like Val McDermott came on and she did this football team that she's involved in. People talk some extraordinary stuff. Yeah, it's good. Everyone came on. Anne Cleves came on. She was stuck in a cottage in the middle of nowhere, and her internet didn't work, and it completely collapsed with it. And she was being so anxious to do it properly. It was so sweet, There I was like going, "It's Anne Cleves. I've got Anne Cleves," and she was the one going, "Oh, my internet's not working," and it was hilarious.
Do you because you still do reading parties as well, don't you?
Yeah. Well, actually, Beck did one last night. Becca Day, who came along when I was so reading parties. If you haven't been to them, the whole idea is I kind of again inspired by how do we come together in lockdown, and I thought one of the things that people seem to like is being part of the writer's journey, and so maybe if we all read something together, then it's going to bring readers and writers together. So there was a thing where you have a chapter from a book and you go around the room and everybody reads a few sentences and together you produce the book. And because you might not have read the book, or all you get sent is a few sentences, you don't know what the chapter is going to be until you all read it together. And I think that's quite a nice experience. It's hellish to organise. It's a complete nightmare. But we did lots of them just coming out of lockdown and it was really good. And there again, Sam says she did one nights for Lauren Norton, loved it. But so Becca came back and said, "Look, William, we've got to keep this going." And she sort of re-envisaged it as a live thing going through StreamYard, very much like this. So then you've got a legacy for those things. Because I had these little paid parties where you bought a book and stuff like that. And it was just such a nightmare organising. I was doing it with Bert's books. And it's a lovely idea, but, it took me so long to organise each one. And then I get stressed about the fact, that I hadn't managed to get the extracts to people. And even dividing up the extracts, because there was supposed to be up to 20 people in the room. If you're dividing up an extract into them for 20 and then making sure they all get them, it was just an absurd amount of work. It was great fun and it really worked. But I think Becca's found a clever way to keep it going in a more light touch way. And so hopefully they will do. And I couldn't do the one last night with Lauren.
No, I couldn't either.
In fact, where I'm talking about Becca doing one for the Conspirators. So I hopefully if it's not clashing with a UK crime book event. I'll mention it here, and we can get some people along to that, because all it is just reading it. And it's like the moment you've read, Samantha, don't you think the moment you start reading it, you don't feel foolish because everybody else is doing it. It's actually becomes really good fun.
It is. I went to one for Dead Rich and it was great.
Oh, yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I like that. That was a good one. We had a good full house on that. It was nice. Yeah, it was really good. And even people like, like I'm a huge admirer of Sarah Paretsky, the American writer. And during that phase, she got in touch with me because she said she'd really like my books. And, there's certain things that just make you think, bloody hell. Because really, when I was having kids and didn't have her books kind of kept me sane. And then, for her to become, and so she came to a couple of reading parties just to read. And it was just like, well, that's Sarah Paretsky in there. I just loved it. It was brilliant. But yeah. So it's been a lot of fun.
Well, we're talking about reading parties and things like that. Tell us what you've read that you've enjoyed recently.
That's a really good question. Well, I read, do you know that book that just won the CWA Dagger, The Kingdoms of Savannah, by a writer called George Dawes Green? And I'm not convinced it should have won the Gold Dagger, but it's a really brilliant book. And the only reason I'm saying that is I think that Gold Dagger should be books that are more connected to bookshops. The book, I was speaking to a Wolsten's bookseller at Harrogate, and he'd never heard of the book. But it's a great book. It's in that American tradition of I don't know, just really writerly crime fiction. And it's set in Savannah, and it's kind of about the history of Savannah and this sort of underclass and the upper classes there and things like that. The first book of his I ever read, he's only ever written 4 books. He's written one book every decade. It was a book called The Caveman's Valentine, and it was about a person who's having psychiatric delusions, who's living homeless in Central Park. But his psychiatric delusions aren't illogical. So he actually solves the mystery, even though they're in his delusory world. And it's such a clever book, and I love that. What else have I read? I'm actually, bizarrely enough, I'm reading of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, because I'm writing, because that, I mentioned that Californian book. It's kind of set about 10 years after the book I was trying to write. And, I was really disappointed. It's not the book I remember. I was thinking, actually, it's nowhere near as good as I remember it. But maybe that's just the thing. I'm about to start reading.
I always disappoint people by telling them that I hate John Steinbeck's books.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'm going to read Cannery Row as well, which I also remember loving, and maybe it's not as what I remember it. But
I read it too many times. So yeah, Sam said she loved Of Mice and Men. I do not. Yeah. I read it too many times at school.
And it is it's one of those classic books you can study at school, and that never does a book any favors. What else?
Well, we did. I don't know, because we did Wuthering Heights when I was at school.
Oh yeah, and you love that, do you?
Distinctly reading Wuthering Heights in like year 9 at school or something, and it's one of my favorite books of all time.
Yeah. No, I mean,
I've got multiple copies of it.
Have you? Brilliant.
Yeah, I absolutely adore it.
I think it's always a bit dangerous, though, isn't it, being told to study books? Because certainly, I mean, I'm not trying to say I'm writing books that will be studied at GCSE or anything like that, but what writers are doing and what people tell you they're doing, it seems so far apart,
But you studied English, so
well,
you must have.
I was going to go and do it at university, but I chickened out because I actually liked reading too much. And I kept hearing from people who studied English at university and they ended up hating reading. They spent I think it's quite typical that people do English at university and they don't read any fiction for 3 or 4 years afterwards, because it's just like being beaten out of them and they've stopped enjoying it. And I didn't want that to happen, so I did social anthropology instead.
So that sounds interesting.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And then became a journalist, which had nothing to do with it at all.
Does that help you though? Like the anthropology help when you're writing?
I think, good anthropology is about just observing people and stuff like that. And I think good writing is about that. I'm not sure. I think I did it for those sort of reasons. I think I love people watching. It's my, I think all of us do to a certain extent, but I think it's one of those things that writers are good at. And it's one of the reasons why writers really all like lockdown at first, because finally everybody left us alone and we could do it on our own. But I became a bit nervous that if you didn't see people behaving bizarrely, you were going to lose what writing was about. You know, you've got to go and observe people and sort of steal their conversations a bit.
Writers and teachers. I think
teachers, yeah. Well, I mean, teachers
are just inherently nosy people.
Do you think so? I suppose you must have to be a teacher. You see, I'm a terrible teacher. Occasionally I get asked to teach people about writing, and I always unpack things in the wrong way. I think because everybody says writers are so empathetic, they're really good at empathy. But I think actually teachers have to be doubly empathetic, because they've got to almost you've got to be able to see it from the other point of view to even start teaching, haven't you? You know, you've got to be able to imagine. I'm really bad at that. I just gabble on, as you might have noticed.
Either that, or you've just got to be really good at pretending you know what you're doing.
Okay. But you know, like that point when a child has lost any idea of what you're talking about, you have to kind of go back and think about where they lost you, don't you? And things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find that quite hard.
It gives you some fun stories, though. I would imagine, like, being a writer, you do see some weird behaviours and, like, cool stuff that, you know, I think there's probably a meshing point between teachers and writers.
Okay, I can live with that, yeah. Donna did English at A-level and hated it, you see. Yeah.
I didn't do English past school.
Yeah. I mean, you know.
Although it is English, literature and history were the 2 GCSEs I passed.
Were they? Yeah.
School. Yeah.
English, I did really well in sciences and dropped them, you see. I should have
carried. I failed science and I'm a science teacher.
Yeah. But also the other thing is that, and this is nothing to do with it, but the point at which you learn taught things is often not the point at which you want to learn them, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? It's just like you get given so much stuff at different ages at school, and actually sometimes you know it's years later you actually get interested in that stuff. Some of it. That was a real witter, wasn't it?
No, it's cool. So at Harrogate, they didn't have the Conspirators in the bookshop either, did they?
Yeah, I was a bit pissed off about that, to be honest. I did complain to I didn't complain, I just mentioned it to my editor. My editor was really pissed off. But it's this G.W. Shaw, William Shaw thing, to be fair, because I was obviously hired as William Shaw, because they'll know the bookshop, goes William Shaw. And I've done a few events where they've done that as well. And you do have to remind them that I'm also G.W. Shaw. It's obviously, there I was complaining about American publishers changing the name of my books, but obviously changing your name as a writer comes with certain risks, doesn't it? So it was a kind of well-meaning mistake, but they should have worked a little bit harder, shouldn't they? I love Harrogate. I think the tent at Harrogate is one of my happiest places. And I know that pretty much everybody in the right-hand column I'm looking at has been there. And if you haven't, I'm not trying to say you have to go, but it's the idea of just being in a tent where there's all these like-minded readers and writers that you know, especially when it's tipping down outside, so you all have to huddle. It's great, isn't it, that tent? It's lovely. It's a really nice sort of, experience.
So nice to just hang out with everyone that you know and like, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was telling people I was going and they were like, are you going on your own? And I was like, well, I'm only traveling there on my own. All my friends will be there.
Yeah.
Like, it's going to be fine.
Yeah. I mean, the first time I went as a first-time author, I was terrified and spent a lot of time walking into rooms and then walking backwards out again because, I didn't know anybody in the room and just thought, oh, God, I don't know anybody here. But, I think on the Saturday night, I met a drunken author and everything has been right ever since.
And now you go and you're one of the stars.
Oh, well, it does feel like in the first, 2021 was the first one after lockdown. And I walked up the hill to the hotel, and this sounds very indulgent for anybody who hasn't been there, but it's sort of like crime writers are such a lovely community, and the people who read and know it. It's just I was a journalist for years, and while I loved a lot of my colleagues and things like that, they're miserable as hell, But crime writers are great, optimistic people who are really keen to see you and tell you their ideas. Walking up the hill to the Old Swan that time, and it was like I hadn't seen many people for much of a year. I got very emotional. I felt like crying there and then, just sort of seeing so many of my friends standing. And it was sunny for a change as well.
Yeah, I think I missed the 2021 one. I'm pretty sure I got pinged and couldn't go.
Yeah, it wasn't a huge gathering, but it was very special. If you didn't finish a conversation all weekend, then you done Harrogate right, says Donna. Yeah, It's yeah. But also, I mean, I'm a member of the CWA, and I've joined the committee, and it's like Basim Khan, me, Graham Bartlett's on it, Sarah Ward, um, Sam Blake, people like that, and we're trying to change it into more of a model that looks like that big tent, because rather than just having sort of small, slightly dufferish dinner parties, I think really if we can bring people together and they can just talk to each other and share their knowledge, because the best thing about being a crime writer and meeting other crime writers is they tell you stuff you need to know about crime writing. They tell you, or they make you feel relaxed about, not everything you do is a wild success, and you realize that happens to everybody, and it's really good to learn it. One of the best things I did as a result of lockdown was do a project called The Bookmakers, which was a volunteer run bookshop. It was a 6-month project. And the whole idea was that you could have a book sale space that was also a community space, because a lot of good bookshops are now community spaces too. And it's trying to make it let's start with the community space and then form a bookshop on it. So one of the things that got all the volunteers to do is when somebody comes into the shop and say and speaks to them, you ask them whether they write or not. And it was really interesting. Most people go, no, I'm not a writer. No, because it's kind of a weird thing to admit to. And actually, you'd talk to them for another 5 minutes, and you'd find they'd written 5 novels and had them sitting in their drawers. But the sad thing sometimes was you meet writers and they hadn't met other people, and they'd tried to do a lot of stuff on their own. And it's so much harder if you don't talk to other writers. Everything's harder. You also make the wrong decisions unless you've had a chance to chat to them.
Well, I think it must be inspiring for other writers to hear of people like you and Ellie who are talking about events where you've gone to and there's been one person.
Yeah.
Or,
yeah.
I remember going to see Ellie and there weren't many people, when we could talk to her for ages. But now you go and you guys are like the headline act, or, the people that sort of everyone wants to go.
Yeah, you do wonder what happens with the sort of Richard Osman, lovely man, and I don't know, Judge Rinder, people who come to a ready packed room and who haven't had to work their way up, because you do it and you become very grateful for every reader in that kind of way. And some writers do just come out and they have a huge hit, like Mark Billingham was successful from the start, and fair play to him. But it's not everybody gets that sort of chance. And Ellie Griffiths worked for years to do that. Ian Rankin, it was, I think, his 8th or 9th novel. He'd slogged, and it's like that Peter James thing. I mean, Peter James, dozens of books before he'd heard the thing. And I think that does give you a really special sense of that. So there is, I think all writers need to live with that sort of stuff.
But I also think it's inspiring for writers who are starting to see that journey that the people that they admire have had.
Now, Laura Hamilton says there's a similar artist-writer space bookshop cafe opening in Worcester on the 5th. If you know them, Laura, I'd love to get in touch, because I love to hear about stuff like that. That sounds amazing.
Laura might know. She's very active in the book community.
Yeah, that'd be really good. I mean, it's great the number of new bookshops that are opening up. We've got a new one in Shoreham, actually, just opening up this summer. Yeah. And then, of course, one of the volunteers I worked with, who's a writer herself, she was one of the volunteers at the Bookmakers. And when the Kemp Town Bookshop, which is the other direction down the coast, went up for sale, Kathy Hayward is her name, she bought the bookshop. And so if it ever goes wrong, she says, I'm going to blame it all on you. But actually, it's a brilliant bookshop and it's not going to go wrong.
No, we need more bookshops like that. I discovered Truman Books recently.
Oh, yeah.
They were the books for our event, but they're really close to where I live, and I didn't know.
I met the woman who runs it, and she's just really inspiring and was so just like, I think the new generation of booksellers are just completely different from the old sort of tweedy blokes who sat around there and say, just like, here are my books, buy them. They're really engaged like her, and they're willing to step up and do events. She was great.
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking to her at Harrogate as well. It was great.
Oh, was she there? I didn't see her.
Yeah.
Damn, I've gone and...
Just on Friday evening, I think.
Yeah.
Remind everyone you've got a minute. Do some book ads, because we've distracted you by talking to you about nonsense.
I have a book, and it's called The Conspirators, and it's a thriller. And also, I should just also say that next May, for those who like Cupidy, I've just handed in. Look, this pile of paper here is a book called The Wild Swimmers, which is I'm just doing the corrections on, and my editor says it's really good, and it's out. I think it's May next year, and should be on sale any second as a sort of pre-sale. But it's been lovely getting back to Dungeness and Alexandra Cupidy.
That's fantastic to know. And The Conspirators is great, everyone, so go and buy it if you haven't
Oh, thank you
already.
so much.
I could not wait. I was so excited to get my hands on a copy in Harrogate.
Very handy. There was one lying around.
It was, wasn't it? But yeah, oh, here we go. Laura said a bit more. The script heaven.
Right.
Haven.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's amazing. Script Haven. Okay, great. Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I think that's a new model, and I was really hoping. Sorry to witter on just briefly, just when we should be
No,
stopping.
fine,
And let you
go for
know
it.
the Brighton Council and the bid, the Brighton Improvement Improvement District will come and say to you, "Oh, this is interesting what you've done. Tell us how we can do this more." Because I think everywhere now needs independent bookshops have the model by which high streets can be saved. If there's enough readers in an area, and I go to places now and I just look around thinking, oh, this place could support a bookshop, and you can just tell there's enough people around on the street, things like that, and they don't have one yet, but I bet somebody's going to open one. And once they've got a bookshop, if you've got somebody like your woman you're working with there, they'll connect with a local school, they'll connect with rice groups. Suddenly, all these people come together and they help form a community. Not only do they bring in footfall because people want to come to that shop, they actually do something very different from how normal shops work. And it's a whole different model, and I think it's really exciting what independent bookshops have done in the last sort of decade.
Yeah, they're marvelous. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us. You're genuinely great to talk to.
Thank you so much for having me, and have a good evening, what's left of it.
You're welcome back anytime as well.
Thank you very much.